Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Also from my side, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today. Many colleagues from long time ago. What is net zero? That is what I was asked to present about at the start of this session. And in my work, I study how we can connect what we know about our planet to policy. And net zero targets play an important role in that connection. Since a while, we know that to limit global warming, the total amount of CO2 that we emit needs to be kept to within a finite carbon budget. And this was once again highlighted in the recent 1.5 degrees special report. You can see here two quotes of it, reaching and sustaining net zero global CO2 emissions and declining net non-CO2 radiative forcing would halt anthropogenic global warming on multi-decadal timescales, and in model pathways with no or limited overshoot of 1.5, global net anthropogenic CO2 emissions decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. And also in the most recent IPCC 6th assessment report, it says reaching net zero anthropogenic CO2 emissions is a requirement to stabilize human-induced global temperature increase at any level. So net zero CO2 emissions are really everywhere. And at the same time, also the Paris Agreement mentions that a balance between the anthropogenic sources and sinks of all greenhouse gases needs to be achieved in the second half of the century. In other words, net zero greenhouse gases need to be achieved. And what do those two terms mean? So let's have a look at this. On the right, you can see a graph that I will be slowly building up. Net zero targets are targets for which the sum of remaining anthropogenic emissions and removals is net zero. And they are key parts of Paris-compatible pathways. Any Paris-compatible pathway relies on a combination of at least three joint strategies. The first is CO2 reductions. The second is CO2 removal. And together they combine to create net zero CO2 conditions, where any remaining CO2 emissions over a given period are equal to the amount of CO2 removal. And the third contribution to any Paris-compatible strategy are reductions in other greenhouse gases, where if we combine them by using an emission metric, or to combine them with CO2, we have to use an emission metric. And in the UN Climate Convention, we use a metric called the global warming potential over 100 years, or GWP 100. And when all these remaining greenhouse gases are equal to the amount of removals over a period, we achieve net zero greenhouse gases. You can thus see how net zero CO2 needs stringent reductions in CO2 combined with CO2 removal, and net zero greenhouse gases need even an additional amount of CO2 removal. What do these targets achieve for climate? Here again, two visuals. On the left, it will be the same visual as in the previous slide. On the right, the corresponding temperature outcome. Net zero CO2 emissions result in roughly halting global warming. Indeed, if also we stabilize the forcing of non-CO2 emissions. But reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions, as defined under the Paris Agreement, actually achieves more. Global warming will first peak and is then set on a gradually declining path. And for many, this is surprising, but is actually equally consistent with the Paris Agreement's idea of limiting warming well below 2 degrees while pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5. And to close these presentations, I wanted to highlight one additional point. There are a lot of terms that are being used in the scientific literature, in policy, in the media. Net zero CO2 emissions, net zero greenhouse gases, carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, and their meaning depends on their context. So whenever discussing writing or setting net zero targets, I would really recommend not to assume that others have the same target in mind or have the same concept in mind. Be clear what you're talking about, because the outcomes for the climate can be quite different. Thank you very much.